How about this? Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Zach Holden. I work for the U.S. Forest Service out of Missoula, Montana, Region 1. Just turn the mic off. Okay. Well, that was, Aryan's work was just a perfect segue into what I'm going to talk about, because it means I don't have to explain a lot of the details of the burn severity data. A lot of that's already been clarified. And just thank quickly some of my co-authors, folks that I work with at the University of Montana: Marco Mineta, Alan Swanson, John Abatsoglu, who must be on probably 50% of the talks here at this conference. It's kind of remarkable. And also Jason Forthoff, the author of the Wind Ninja model that I'll be talking a little bit about. Really what I want to talk about more than fire refugia is essentially sort of vegetation management and complex terrain, and understanding what we refer to as topoclimate, sort of fine-scale features of the physical environment that really mediate vegetation properties. Working for the Forest Service, what you quickly realize, or any ecologist who spends time in the field realizes, that very fine-scale sort of features of climate and energy drive large shifts in vegetation. And these patterns are evident everywhere across the landscape if you look at them. And in this picture, for example, you see a slight shift toward a north-facing aspect results in a place where we can support canopy cover, snow drifts in narrow drainages where there's topographic curvature. And these things are actually really important, and things that resource managers or foresters actually use. They determine what we plant where, how fast it's going to grow, and ultimately I think how it will burn. So really, the fine-scale things kind of matter in the forest management world. Here's the Penman-Monteith equation. The promise is the only equation I'll show during this talk, but basically, this is the fundamental equation that governs most of our hydrologic models, climatic water balance models, like Bridget described. And the only point I want to make here is that the terms in this model, radiation, temperature, wind, humidity, they all vary with topographic position. And I kind of want to focus in on that now. So just stepping through this very quickly. Solar insolation, obviously, is a huge driver of energy in complex mountainous terrain. South-facing slopes get a lot more incident radiation than north-facing slopes in general. We see with minimum temperature, as Bridget talked about, we have cold air pools, very prevalent across most of the Rocky Mountains. Any place where we have dry air and mountains, cold air pools at night, and creates very, very different temperature gradients than a sort of a standard adiabatic lapse rate. Look at maximum temperature on average. On a sunny summer day, you're going to have warmer temperatures on south-facing slopes. That's just a function of incident radiation, of course, mediated by canopy cover. If you look at the polar plot here, what you see is that west-facing slopes receiving their sunlight at the latest point in the day. You have sort of this coincidence of high temperatures and solar insolation, so southwest-facing slopes, really the warmest positions on our landscapes. And of course, relative humidity, the humidity variable that we use most often in wildfire management being driven by temperature. We have lower relative humidity generally on south-facing slopes corresponding to temperature. One of the big dogs in the energy equation that we don't really think about very much is wind speed. But here's an example, just Wind Ninja simulation from one day, just a KML output from the Wind Ninja model. What you see on average is a lot of variation in wind speed, but lower wind speeds in valley bottoms, higher wind speeds on ridge tops. And when you look at just sort of an average daily 2012 wind speed map there for this is the Skalkaho Basin, by the way, just a place I've done a lot of field work in western Montana. You see that much lower wind speeds on average in our valleys. So, last but definitely not least, there's a lot of variation in soil properties with topography. This may be obvious to all of you folks. I'm not a soil scientist. This has been kind of an interesting thing to explore and discover. We have two data sets really available to us when we want to use soils in hydrologic models. We have StatsGo and we have Surgo. StatsGo is spatially complete. You can download a gridded data set for the entire country at 1 kilometer, but it doesn't have a lot of refinement or detail in the soil properties. On the other hand, we have Surgo data, and the NRCS has released a very nice product, the G-Surgo, a gridded Surgo data set. The issue there is there's large gaps, particularly in wilderness areas, mountains, large gaps in the available data. But definitely much higher quality. They've invested a lot of time in developing that product. Just zooming in on the gridded Surgo data a little bit here for a chunk of the Bitterroot Mountains, what you see is on average we have deeper soils in our valleys, where over time you have sort of downward flow of water carrying particulates, organic matter accumulating in our valley bottoms. You also see, if you look really closely, on average deeper soils on north-facing slopes. So the point being that there's some fine-scale topographic variation in soil properties, and soils really are the bucket that define how long water stays in the system and remains available for plants. Interacting with sort of climate at, I would argue, very fine scales. So, climate refugia is a topic that's become, I think, of interest to a lot of ecologists. And, fire plays a really important role in this picture because it really mediates the physical environment. We have vegetation that basically blocks solar insolation, keeps near-surface temperatures kind of cool. And when you have a stand-replacing fire, it takes all the vegetation away. You have a really dramatic shift in the physical environment. So, fire we could look at as one of the main accelerants, if you will, of vegetation change in conjunction with climate warming. So, it's really important, I think, ultimately to kind of understand what factors, be they topographic or physically based factors, that will mediate the effects of wildfires and then the corresponding responsive vegetation post-fire. So in 2009 and 2010, I started a pretty large project in the Northern Rockies where we designed a little solar radiation shield, put a little $20 temperature sensor in there, and threw thousands of these things all over the mountains of Idaho and Montana. Have another batch of these that we just pulled in from Oregon and Washington, and basically really put a lot of effort into developing a better understanding of fine-scale variation in air temperature. Have humidity sensors out as well. Haven't touched those data yet, but we're starting to work on that. But basically, just really trying to understand what we refer to as topoclimate. Recently just finished developing a daily surface air temperature model at a spatial resolution of 250 meters. So this is minimum maximum temperature for a resolution of about 250 meters for the Northern Rocky Mountains for Team Min and Team Max. Bridget talked a little bit about those data, used those in her water balance model. And the part of the model that I'll use in the analysis that I'll show in just a minute is what we call cold air drainage potential. So basically what we did was take free air temperatures from reanalysis, the North American Regional Reanalysis data set, looked at those temperatures under stable sort of high pressure conditions, compared those with observations, and then modeled as a function of terrain the difference from free air temperature and come up with this static map of cold air drainage potential. So places that are likely to experience cold air drainage or pooling. And you can see what that map looks like here, expressed in terms of degrees Celsius. And of course what you see is in valley bottoms we have a lot of cold air pooling. In fact, cold air drainage happening all over this, all over this domain. So now going back to wind, really wanted to start to understand and incorporate into our models the effects of near-surface wind speed. So here what we did was take the reanalysis data set again, feed that through a model called Wind Ninja. Did that every day from 1979 to 2013. Here we had to engage supercomputers. We did this on Stampede, which at that time was the 7th largest computer in the world. Millions of simulations that we have to run on basically 1 degree tiles just because of memory limitations of the model. So you can kind of see the artifacts of the tiling in the model there where we're stitching those tiles again after those runs. But get this kind of nice average wind speed climatology. And then returning to soils, again, the Surgo data is really a high quality data set in some places, but there's huge chunks of missing data. So here I took random forest, a bunch of terrain indices, MODIS derived vegetation indices, 12, 13 different variables, developed a predictive model based on the available gridded Surgo data, and then used that to impute the missing values to these chunks of missing areas. So we have a spatially complete map of soil properties for the continental U.S. at 250 meters. I also did this, and what I'll use in my modeling in a second here is 30-meter version of that for the Northern Rockies. And as Bridget noted, climatic water balance is this really nice integrator of the sort of physical mechanisms of moisture and energy. So we can take all those data sets, feed them into a simple monthly climatic water balance model, do that at high resolutions where we're accounting for topoclimate, wind speeds, soil depth, surface air temperature, solar radiation, and get these these pretty maps of climatic water balance deficit, actual evapotranspiration. And what's really interesting about these models, to me at least, is that for the first time we have warmer temperatures on south-facing slopes combined with higher incident radiation. So what this really serves to do is bring out this sort of difference in north versus south-facing slopes. Really evident in our vegetation, but difficult, I think, to model and represent with the available climate data. I'm not going to use these data here at all. This is a climate change, this is a climate change conference, so we can take ensemble GCM data. Here I work with John Abatsoglu. He helped me pull in some different projections, I think 11 different GCMs, forecast these water balance data forward. This is something that we could use eventually if we find models that we like to forecast these kind of things forward. Now to the fire refugia piece of this. Arjen talked about the MTBS data. We have, I think I used 560 some fires from the Northern Rockies, and using the difference normalized burn ratio that he talked about. And I'm just basically sampling pixels, keeping pixels more than 200 meters apart to minimize any spatial autocorrelation, and really just looking at the difference between very low and unburned pixels, so places where MTBS classified those pixels as low severity or unburned, versus everything else. So a binary logistic model. And here's just a simple box plot of what those data look like. This is a sample of probably 1.2 million pixels. And what you kind of see looking at these box plots, no huge patterns emerge, except you do see with cold air drainage potential a higher probability of sort of low severity fire occurring where there's strong cold air drainage. Same thing with wind speed. Areas with a low wind speed have generally on average slightly lower severity. What's interesting about these figures to me too is the green up signal. They produce this class of pixels that they call green up, where things are actually greener in the second image than the first image. And it's kind of intriguing to see that those are really occurring in some of our sort of lowest wind speed, highest cold air drainage potential sites. Not really sure what that means yet. Interesting too that we don't see immediately differences with soil depth or lower severity on north-facing slopes. You kind of see the opposite, in fact. So we'll get to that in just a second. So to try to develop a model of sort of where there's low severity fire or unburned areas, what we call generally climate or fire refugia, I use just a simple general linear model. So second order polynomial terms on radiation and cold air drainage, but otherwise just simple regression. You get an AUC score, an accuracy statistic of about 0.7. That's not a fantastic model. That's like a C model, but there's so much variation in these data that you might imagine, from management, from events happening at the scale of minutes to hours, that we kind of expect this to be a fairly noisy data set. We can get similar accuracy results with something like random forests, gradient boosting, or machine learning algorithms, but it's preferable, I think, to have a regression model, something that's very interpretable. Just diagnosing that GLM a little bit, looking at partial response curves where we hold all of our other variables sort of in place at their mean, and then look at the response of each variable individually. What we see is pretty intuitive. We see sort of going up, increasing as you go up, is the probability of a low severity fire. And pretty intuitively you see higher probability of low severity fire with deeper soils, with higher cold air drainage potential, with lower NDVI. So if our pre-fire vegetation is less dense, of course, you're less likely to have a severe fire. Our deficit anomaly, of course, when things are drier, we have a lower probability of low severity fire. When things are wet, you have a higher probability of that burning less severely. And with our wind speed there in the bottom left, generally higher probability of low severity fire at low wind speeds. Just looking at the interactions that were termed in that GLM, you see kind of an interesting interaction between pre-fire vegetation and soil depth, where our highest probability of having what we call a fire refugia occurs where we have sort of shallow soils and sparse vegetation. No surprise there. But then when we look in the upper right, where we have dense vegetation, a place that characteristically you think might burn as a crown fire, we see a mediating effect of deeper soils. So kind of an interesting interaction there. And with solar radiation, we see kind of an interesting interaction there too, where with our growing season radiation, we see high NDVI, so high pre-fire vegetation and high solar radiation loads, resulting in some of our highest probabilities of low severity fire. And there we're just seeing, again, sort of sparse, warm, south-facing slopes that generally don't have enough vegetation probably to support crown fire. On the opposite end of that spectrum, with high vegetation, you do see kind of a mediating effect of lower solar insolation. So we can take that fitted model, not a great model, not something you maybe want to make a prediction out of, but it is interesting to predict it across the landscape and just see what this picture looks like. And when you do that, you see a pretty distinct pattern emerge, which is our valley bottoms have a much higher probability of burning at low severity or being unburned. You see these, again, the combination of wind speed, soil depth, and cold air drainage playing a role in mediating fire effects. And we can zoom in a little bit just to make that a little bit more clear. Again, the story here really appears to be sort of valley bottoms as refuges for potential fire behavior. So, again, I just want to bring a couple of points home. There's a very fine scale variation in energy and moisture in the complex mountainous terrain that characterizes most of the Pacific Northwest. And I think we have evidence from our historical fires, from the MTBS data set, that these mediate the effects of wildfires when they occur. These valley bottoms, again, are very unique environments. There's a number of physical factors that make them different from other parts of the mountain. And of course, there's interactions between pre-fire vegetation and these site characteristics. So the control that we have is obviously on vegetation. The part that we don't control is kind of topoclimate or microclimate, and those interactions and understanding them should be important. I just threw this slide up there and a bunch of question marks because, as far as incorporating this stuff into planning or management, I don't know really how we do that, or if our agencies are really, able to use this information. But I think from a fire management perspective, there's big implications for developing this kind of physically based understanding of moisture and energy across the landscapes. And so what I put up here is our classic kind of fire triangle. If anyone's been through fire training, you remember weather, terrain, vegetation, and fuels form our fire triangle. And at the intersection of all of that stuff is topoclimate. It's this fine scale variation that's mediated by all of these factors. And so I would argue that if we really want to make a difference in terms of how we manage fires, getting more fire in the landscape to mediate the effects of fires in the future, this is really something we're going to have to incorporate into management. And just finally a plug for our current project, which we call TopoFire. Basically, everything I've shown here, the temperature downscaling, soils, radiation, we're doing for the continental U.S. Historically, from 1979 to present, and then in real time. And this will eventually become the Wildland Fire Assessment System, so our national system for monitoring basically fire danger. And I think this will give us ultimately the capacity to start developing this understanding of how microclimate or topoclimate mediates fire danger and fire effects. So that's all I have. Be happy to take any questions. Crickets. Oh wait, Charlie's gonna ask a question. Great.
Thanks, Zach. One of the big questions that's been asked a lot lately is this notion of management in riparian areas, and where you've shown that those are fire refugia to an extent, but there's a lot of discussion about how those react to fires versus other places. Do you have some sense as to how big of the drainage is necessary, or other characteristics of which ones form better refugia versus not? It's part of the question that's out there. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that, at the resolution we're doing a lot of this work. What I particularly noticed with the soil properties was 250 meters is not fine enough to capture some of the very fine scale features of soil, which ultimately would drive things like riparians and wetlands. So I think, there'll be a limitation to how well we can characterize things like that. But as far as like how big a drainage or where, I literally just sort of made these model predictions a few days ago, and I think there's a lot of exploration to do. I think it would be great if I could work with Arjen and Crystal since they're doing the same thing, and kind of really explore this in a more robust way. But.
Hi, Zach. I was wondering if you could mention the number of attributes that you have imputed for this Sergo data set. You kind of filled in the hole, so how many attributes are we talking about? Like, how is the Sergo suite possible? Ballpark.
Oh yeah, okay. So actually, what I did was, run a script to query the soil data access database online, populate the map unit key, and then I have custom algorithms for deriving Brooks Quarry lambda, soil depth, soil porosity, percent sand, silt, clay, available water holding capacity, a couple more, and we have actually a project now funded through the regional office to do this better than I did it. I'm not a soils guy, so I just ran at it and got some stuff done. But we can expand that list. So if there's something that I missed that you're particularly interested in, then you should shoot me an email, tell me, and we can, I'm sure, do it.
For free?
For free. Yes.
Thanks, Zach. That was really useful. In terms of valley bottoms, it seems like another variable is, of course, the forest condition within those areas. A lot of riparian areas, certainly on the east side, because of policy, have become neglected. They're not treated. They become ingrown, dense. They've densified, and because of fire suppression, they're virtually have become fire corridors. So the input of kind of that existing potential, right, based on conditions. So maybe you could address that.
The best I could do is grab the pre-fire greenness for each of these fires.
Yeah.
Arjen alluded to the fact that, when you use some existing vegetation product in a model like this and then try to go back to a fire that burned in the 1980s, doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
Things have changed. Yeah, that's a tough one. You did see in this simple regression model some interactions between some of these variables and greenness. So, obviously, the more green vegetation you have pre-fire, the higher probability there is of it burning severely. But as far as like how to manage those valley bottoms where you have these incredibly dense, like productive spruce forests, I'm not going to touch that one.
Yeah, it seems like structure, really plays a pretty key role there. Dense understory structure versus open, or the lack of, a dense understory.
Yeah. But there are also places that we can manage from, and that's something I didn't talk about, but you can access those areas relatively easily. You can backburn. Often you have fires traveling downhill, so backburning into those areas. Other factors of, sort of near-term fire behavior that are going to contribute to the results that I found in this data analysis. But yeah, again, as far as how to manage them, because they are so productive and potentially dense, I don't know.
Yeah, many of those valley bottoms are just extremely departed from what you would expect, or what might be there simply because of adjacent fire suppression.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, that is the end of our wildfires session.